Anyone else with any thoughts on that? And
Well,
it's a
Darren, I
case of shock and
didn't realize that we're borrowing from these ancient writings, but you know, your first reaction is it's like a kick in the gut. Well, how dare we add things? But then you think of the Nicene Council and the early church fathers who put together the canon of scriptures and the influence of Rome and Constantine and all these people on it, then, you know, you can't just dismiss anything. And just the adoption of Christmas and Easter into what is known to be Christian practice, there's error there already. And then, as you well say, I mean, I love reading some of the early church fathers, even Wesley and Pink and all these guys, and you know, the real, even William Booth stuff in that. But we do know that there's a lot of errors in a lot of, because he's all humans. But we readily accept the opinions of people like John Hagee or so and so, you know. And
Right.
yeah, you've got the actors and these ancient scriptures and what's it, the Book of Enoch. And for me, what you've taught us over the years is basically it's like having a tape measure or a yardstick or a measuring stick. You just measure up what is being said, and it's supplemental. It's not replacing the
Easy
core
enough.
scripture that we have. You know what I mean? So as you say now, you read, you follow the narrative of the gospel and of the kingdom which is to come. And these things are just like the colorization of the old World War One movies, you know, like they shall not grow old with Peter Jackson did. We took the old footage of the First World War and he colorized it, and it added so much humanity into the picture. It was just like black and white, but when you see in real terms, it almost brings it into a new reality. And so by adding to these things, unless of course you choose to remain uninformed and you choose to willfully be ignorant of the detail, you know, like the Hasmonean dynasty, and elevating one person above another because it suits my lifestyle to, you know, go with this prosperity preacher because that's the way I operate. Or if I was like a Nicaean and I want to go and put myself into the desert in isolation, then I will go with that author, you know, and that would just be silly.
Right. Yeah, so it might be a shock to the system, but the evidence is there. And if you could read and look at the two paragraphs, clearly Paul is copying, he's literally quoting from other sources. And as I said to you, I'm going to show you Jesus did it too. So I don't know what you're going to think of Jesus when that's done, but you're going to see it tonight. Okay, 164 BC to 4 BC. Sorry, someone say something.
Yeah, I was just about to say, just working with you and Quentin on the Moses thing. What's it called again? 1, 2, 3 into Moses' head. Moses did this. A lot of the stuff in Genesis. I don't think we have access to a lot of those books now and stories, but he had because I remember you showing, I can't remember who showed me, but you told me, then I saw it also at the time that during Moses, the Pharaoh that adopted Moses, so not the Pharaoh that Moses grew up with, who ended up taking, started building a big library and had all this information that now a lot of historians believe Moses used to as reference points to create a lot of what is known as Torah. And I'm sure the prophets did it. So a lot of the books we don't have access, and some, I think some is one of the oldest recorded books left, the story of Gilgamesh, is very much like Noah, and probably Noah used it as a kind of like a polemic rebuttal against the story of Gilgamesh. You know? So it's not new even with the apostles. It's always been throughout the Bible where we had these extra biblical stuff that they agreed with and sometimes even disagreed with, but used as but referenced a lot in their books.
Right, no, but that's it. And again, it doesn't have to be scary. I know that it would be scary to Christian sensitivities, but that's, I've said this before too, that's a Christian problem. That's not a Bible problem. That's a Christian problem. So, okay, how do we summarize 159 years of the Maccabean history? Because it's a lot. Now, if we're going to start in the top right-hand corner there, at the top left-hand corner, 160 BCE. We obviously move our way down, 153, 147 BCE, 143, 135, 104. You can tell we're moving down literally into the first century with Jesus. Now, again, obviously on the screen, we're seeing a timeline here with little, very summarized events of the main characters and one of basically one big thing that they did until we end here at the bottom with 30 BCE. Herod ends the male Asmonean line by killing Hyrcanus II. The point is again that this detail is complicated. The story is complicated. And this is the events that sets up the first century Jesus is born into. And that again is the point here. This Maccabean, this Hasmonean, this Hanukkah story sets up the situation Jesus is born into. Now, I'm going to start quoting or start referencing some of the things that get said about the literature that's not considered canon. So one of the things that there is in the patriarchs, the testimony of the patriarchs, is in the testament of Levi, which logically now Levi is the tribe that the Asmoneans, the Maccabees come from, because they're Levites priests. That's my family's lineage. There's a prophetic statement that gets made. And the statement is this: there'll be three kingdoms. The first one obviously being Moses, because Moses is the lawgiver. And do remember, Moses is a Levite. Aaron, his brother. And then check this third one. Now remember, this is an ancient document, right? That gets established prior to Jesus coming. So this is, now please, let's note this. I'm not suggesting everything in these testaments are absolute outright facts. I'm not suggesting that these things were written by Levi, of course. I've told you that this, using the name of the pseudonym kind of situation was done. It wasn't even necessarily, in all cases, a conspiracy. It was just a styling of how things got done. Now, what I will say is this: there is some scholars who believe that part of these testaments had been updated, if we can call it that, following Jesus' death and resurrection, and that those Jews who were following Jesus might have gotten hold of copies of this or made copies of these testimonies of the patriarchs and added a Jesus-friendly spin on it. Okay, and we'll look a bit into what that might have looked like. So it's to suggest that these documents were started before Jesus was born, because the history of the Maccabees appears before Jesus is even born. But there are some scholars who believe that some of it has been edited, some versions had been edited, and it's not even difficult to see which ones they think that was done to make it, a standoff between Jesus and the Maccabees kind of thing, which is an interesting theme in itself, which I don't mind exploring even maybe tonight, because I do believe that there's a challenge from Jesus to the Maccabean history. Does that make sense? And please note, when I say the Maccabean history, I'm not talking about the original purity of Mattathias or some of his sons that meant to do well. I mean, over the whole period of Maccabean history and what they become. And that's what we're going to look at. So you can see the three kingdoms: Moses, Aaron, John Hyrcanus. We're going to look at John Hyrcanus as we move on, to give you perspective on that and to contrast it with Jesus. So the end of the Hasmoneans. Now remember, what are the Hasmoneans? They are the dynasty, the kingship, the kingdom that flows out of the Maccabees, that flows out of the good thing that Hanukkah was, but it doesn't stay good, and we will explore why it doesn't stay good. To do that, we're going to go back to last week's session quickly, between a rock and a Herod place. and just point out something, because this is important. Emperor Augustus said the following: "It is better to be Herod's pig than son." Now, when a Roman official of that level finds the time to tell you that Herod's a difficult and dangerous man, then you've got to know this guy was something else. So let's think about this now for a second. Let's look at the story of the Hasmoneans. They start off as priests. They pretty much save Israel with what happens with Mattathias, what he does, and his sons go into a war that was probably necessary. The Greeks didn't wipe out the Jews in that situation, which proves God was in favor. God supported the effort. Let's say that. He sanctioned what they ended up doing, which we know because they were successful. And that's why there's Hanukkah. There's Hanukkah because it worked. There's Hanukkah because these untrained priests started a rebellion that worked. Now that's interesting, isn't it? Rebellion. Because in the first century, effectively, when Jesus is on the scene, that's what's happening. An attempt to rebel against Rome is happening. So there's another parallel between Hanukkah and what comes out of it and what Jesus is born into. Okay, this Hasmonean kingdom is, the Maccabees start off right. They were priests. That's what they sanctioned to be. They sanctioned to be priests, not anything else. So let's jump again to Jesus is born in the first century. So we got that. We got him born in the first century. But what has happened prior to him coming? And that's obviously, again, the setup of the time that he's born into is the Maccabean history. It is the story of Hanukkah and what played out after Hanukkah that creates the first century political, social, religious space Jesus is born into. So that's why I say you can't sever that history from Jesus' entry into time and space. So we said now it's better to be Herod's pig than to be a son, and we're about to see why. If you remember from last week's session, I showed you that Herod kills. So let's quickly say this. Herod marries Mariamne, which is one of the last true Hasmonean bloodline children. So he marries into the Hasmonean bloodline, Herod. That's intentionally done. He's not Hasmonean, he's not Jewish, but his ancestors were forced to accept Judaism at the edge of a sword. And remember, I said the irony of that is that that's what the Maccabees fought to stop the Greeks from doing to them. It's the only time in Jewish history that Jews have been forcing someone else to convert. And it's under John Hyrcanus, who I said we were going to look more at as one of the Maccabees. So anyway, Herod marries Mariamne. Obviously, guys, think about this. If Herod marries a Hasmonean woman, doesn't that prove to you just how important the Hasmonean / Hanukkah story remains even in Jesus' day? Just can I get a comment on that? Because I really think that needs to be highlighted here. Does it make sense? Can you like, my word, okay, I get that. Yeah, that is actually interesting. He marries the last Hasmonean woman from that bloodline, from that dynasty. Do you get how that proves the connection? Anyone just give me an indication that it's making some kind of sense?
Doesn't it legitimize his kingship then?
Exactly. And that's the point. Tell me what you did right. Let's say this. It's to legitimize his claim to be the king of the Jews. What does that tell you about the importance of the story of Hanukkah then in the first century? That's a question that I can probably ask. Does the fact that he marries into that Hasmonean line, can you see that proves the importance of Hanukkah? That's my question. Anyone want to comment on that?
Sorry, I've got to go back and say what is Hanukkah. I'm very sorry.
No, Hanukkah, Kathy, is the time that the Greeks attempted to have the priest. Well, they were doing a lot of things. Part of it was to stop the sons from being circumcised, to stop the reading of Torah. They were trying to Hellenize Jews, to eradicate Judaism and to eradicate any semblance of Jewish identity. And Mattathias in Modin, that was a priest in that area, is asked to eat pig, to eat pork off an altar, as obviously a sign of submission to Greece. And instead, he kills a Greek soldier in a moment of rage or righteous indignation, lining up perfectly with the nature of Levites generally. And then they have to run into the hills, him and his sons, and decide, okay, have we just killed the Jewish lineage by doing this? Maybe, but we cannot have our culture, our history smothered out by the Greeks. So we will fight, and if God is with us, we'll win. If we don't win, we die, then that's the end of Jews. And effectively, of course, they win. It's a miracle. That's why Hanukkah is often spoken of as a time of miracle. Um, and then, of course, the more traditional side is that when they fought their way back into the temple, there wasn't enough oil that had been prepared to keep the candles going, the menorah going, sorry. And so miraculously, the oil, the little bit that they found in reserve, lasted for 8 days. That I am not 100% sure is a fact that happened, but it's a midrash, it's a story. The point is, Chanukah is a miracle story of resilience, of priests standing up and doing their job, of protecting Jews from being assimilated into the nations around them. So Herod is marrying.
Yeah.
Herod is marrying the daughter, the last official descendant from that line of those priests, those Levites that we then call the Maccabees, or we call the Hasmonean dynasty that starts this dynasty. He marries into that. And like my father said, that's to legitimize. And so my point is, if Herod is legitimizing his claim to quote unquote a Jewish kingdom, doesn't that authenticate the whole story of Hanukkah, the good, bad, and the ugly of it? Doesn't that prove that even Jesus being born in the first century has everything to do with Hanukkah and what had come before in the whole wide story of Hanukkah? That's my question. Can you see, Kathy? Here's my point. Can you see how Herod's efforts legitimizes the value of Hanukkah?
Yes, I can now that you've broken down what Hanukkah is.
You see, and so
Yeah.
how is that not important to anyone who opens the Gospels?
Absolutely, yeah.
It has to be, because you gutting the story if you don't keep that as the framework of what you're reading through. So obviously now what I've been doing the last 3 weeks, we focused on Herod. We looked a bit very scantily at the history of Hanukkah. We focused more in on Herod because it's logical, because Herod is a key figure in the first century. He's mentioned, his son is mentioned. So that's an easy way to bridge for Christians. Say, okay, you've heard of this guy and you've heard of his son. You maybe have confused them and thought there's only one, but there's actually two that feature prominently. And you need to know these guys and who they are. And you can't know who they are if you don't know where they came from. And inevitably, again, where they came from is part of the Hanukkah story. So really, again, it's like I feel like saying, go back to your pastor and get your tithes back or your money back, because you've not gotten your value for your money. If me saying this is the first time you're hearing this stuff, then you've been done in. So, but anyway, back to Herod. Herod kills Miriam's brother. Herod kills Miriam's grandfather. Herod kills Miriam's mother. Herod kills his son, but it's Miriam's son as well. So it's someone who's got some kind of link to the Hasmoneans, is the point. He kills his other son. And finally, Herod even kills his own wife, who he actually did love. Now, that's quite a lot to take in, that one man would do this to people within his own family circle, and yet Herod did it. But that's not even the biggest point, actually, because my point is not to show you how scary Herod is. The point is, I said that this is the end of the Hasmonean dynasty, right? That's what I said. And then the question is, what's the lesson that should be learned out of this? The answer, in a very nutshell kind of experience here, Levi should be priests, because that's what Levites were called to be. Judah should be kings. Does that make sense? God appointed the Levites to be priests. Did he appoint the Levites to be kings? No. Judah's supposed to have the kings. So the whole Hasmonean dynasty of putting Levites as kings is part of the problem. Okay? So if you think about it logically, God sanctions the original Hanukkah story, which is good and it's beautiful and it's right and it needs to be commemorated. Jesus commemorated, Jesus celebrated it, and we know that from John 10, he did that. So that's there and that's good. But this whole Hasmonean kingdom that comes after it shouldn't necessarily be automatically entwined with the story of Hanukkah, if that makes sense. I want to be clear that Hanukkah gives birth or allows a space where the Hasmonean story will play out. But the Hasmonean story isn't justified because of Hanukkah. That's a separate issue that contributes to the political instability and tension of the first century. And this is where we turn our attention to Jesus now. So although I'm saying on the screen now we got extra biblical confirmation of the coming of a new king and priest, we're literally going to talk about Jesus now. You cannot ignore that we're coming out of how did this happen? What went wrong? What went wrong with the Hasmoneans? Why does it matter? Does it really matter that Levites became priests? Is that a big deal? Yes, it is. And it's a big deal because God has established how things must work. And we can't screw with what God establishes. That's kind of the thing. So what I want to take you into now, if I haven't lost you yet, is to say, okay, the Hasmonean kingdom was a mess and it was a mistake. So how does that rolling out, and it's the candle, let's rather use that analogy, the snuffing out of the Hasmonean candle, how does that link to Jesus coming on the scene? Does that make sense? And watch how beautifully it overlaps, actually. You got all of those people being, the last of the Hasmonean line being murdered by Herod, right? I've just shown you how he murders them. And right while that's happening, what's also simultaneously happening? A baby is being born. Watch this. A baby is being born to the tribe of Judah in Bethlehem. Someone tell me what's happening here. Someone frame for me Herod killing those 6 people and this baby being born. What do you notice? Please, someone make my evening. I don't mind how you frame it. Just tell me what's happening.
Yeah, Darren,
Yes.
John. Yeah, that a priesthood has been established again. Could that be
Right, you spot
what's happening
on.
here? Because the priesthood has been snuffed out actually by the kingship of Herod.
Right,
That's what I can see. And so there's a new priesthood starting up,
right,
starting up through Jesus. Yeah.
exactly. And what else, John, with that? It's on your screen, so you can see it.
But
He's
a king.
right,
He's setting himself up as a king and a priest, which is representing the tribe of Judah and the Levites.
right. John, is that not a beautiful thing to see?
It is. It is.
We're watching the snuffing out of a mistake that was never supposed to happen. And you can't even really appreciate me calling it a mistake unless you take some time to delve into the Maccabean history, where you can actually just see how messed up it got, how unfortunately messed up it got, that even the good kings in the midst of the Hasmonean dynasty could not pull it off. They couldn't fix it.
Is
Because,
it?
yes,
No, I was just going to say, is it? I just remember reading somewhere in the part where after the Maccabeans, as the Levites had, established themselves after the revolt, but that actually the Jew from the tribe of Judah had not really come to the place of actually put themselves in a position of being the kings that they're supposed to be. So it's sort of like, it sort of seemed, I sort of got the impression that the Levites had no option other than to set themselves up as kings because Judah was not playing their part. But I could be wrong. That's what I was reading into the history of the Maccabeans. Could that be right or wrong?
you are right, John, and that's part of the tragedy, is that they, with good intentions, stepped into a space to try and fill a gap, to keep the story, to keep the momentum going. So it is, there's that statement, a comedy of errors, but this isn't a comedy, it's a tragedy of errors that pretty much seals in this 159, 160 odd years. And what my point is, that 160 odd years is absolutely vital if you're going to make good sense of this child born into Bethlehem. That's my goal for tonight. With all this historical backstory, whatever, it's actually to say you cannot do Jesus justice if you don't understand what he was born into. Because if you can't grasp the majesty and the magnitude of watching 6 Hasmoneans, the last remnant, being wiped out, unfairly even actually, and that overlapping with the birth of a child to the kingdom of Judah, I mean, that we could stop here and it would be an awesome evening. And my point is, this is part of the gospel. We have to have this intact. We have to see this, and now we're going to actually get into the really juicy stuff to say, wow, let's see Jesus in a new light again and fill in the blanks kind of thing. So let's see if we can do that. Okay, so here's from the Jerusalem Talmud, which is obviously not in the canon that you would call a Bible. It has been taught 40 years before the destruction of the temple. The western light went out. The crimson thread remained crimson, and the lot for the Lord always came up in the left hand. They would close the gates of the temple by night and get up in the morning and find them wide open. Said to the temple, Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai, O temple, why do you frighten us? We know that you will end up destroyed, for it has been said, open your doors, O Lebanon, that the fire may devour your cedars, quoting Zechariah 11:1. So what you got here is from the Jerusalem Talmud. 40 years before the destruction of the temple, a few things have happened. That's what it's explaining here. Now, here's what's excitingly interesting to note. The Jerusalem Talmud is not pro-Jesus. It's not in favor of Jesus. This part is telling the history between 30 AD and 70 AD. And yes, it's saying 4 things happened. The western light would go out. The crimson thread didn't turn white. The lot fell in the left hand for the Lord, and the open door of the temple. So let's start with the western light. Here's what's amazing. The western light refers to one of the lights of the menorah. Guess which one it is? It's the shamash, which in the menorah is what they call the servant candle. It's the one that lights all the others. In fact, for Hanukkah this year again, I'll be doing it. My daughter helps me do it, and my son, who is now 3, is actually starting to ask what's Hanukkah. He's going to be seeing it for the first time, that he can actually process what's happening. And who do we Who do we imply metaphorically is the Shamash, or the servant light of the menorah? Who do we say it is?
Messiah, Jesus.
Jesus. Isn't it interesting that between 30 and 70 AD, supernaturally, eerily upsetting and worrying the priests in the temple, the Sanhedrin, the Sadducees, who stem from the Maccabean story and the corruption that happened, those guys were getting nervous because that light kept on going out for the remaining 40 years before the temple was destroyed. It's interesting, eh? The crimson thread. So on the Day of Atonement, it was traditionally believed. Now I'm not going to try and get into all the details. Let's just say this. A crimson thread was supposed to turn white. And for the last 40 years, it didn't turn white. That's documented history. I've just shown you where it's in the Jerusalem Talmud. They're telling you it didn't turn white. And they saw that as a bad omen. They knew something was wrong. Relating also to Yom Kippur was the lot. So the lot would fall in the left or the right hand, and the lot was falling in the left hand, which means it didn't fall in the proper hand that would signify God's favor for Israel in that year. So that was another bad omen for 40 years prior to the destruction of the temple. And finally, the doors would open of the temple on its own, supernaturally again. And that's where you can see the one rabbi says, obviously quoting from Zechariah, taking something from Zechariah and misappropriating it on purpose. Well, I say on purpose, it was just a poetic way of talking, as to imply that there would come destruction on the temple.